Caleb Nourse only reached up to help Lucy settle her backpack into the overhead rack, but when he dropped back into the seat beside her and let his hand rest on the armrest, something in his body went quiet and attentive in the way it did when the world was trying to tell him something. The train hadn't moved yet. Platform staff were still loading luggage at the far end of the car. The engines of Via Rail's morning run from Toronto to Ottawa were cycling through their warm-up register, low and familiar, the sound of something large gathering itself for a long day's work. The October platform was visible through the window, gray and damp, a few pigeons picking their way along the edge of the concrete. None of that was what had stopped him. It was the armrest. Or more precisely, it was what his palm was reading through the armrest. A faint but distinct pulse beneath the ambient vibration, arriving at intervals of roughly 11 seconds, varying by perhaps half a second in either direction. Not mechanical, not the rhythm of a moving part, something structural, responding to the locomotive's idle vibration, the way a stretched cable responds to the wind passing over it, resonating rather than rotating, speaking rather than grinding. Caleb had spent 8 years learning to hear that language. He had been very good at it once, in a previous version of his life. He was still good at it, even though that version of his life had ended in a way that had cost him considerably. Lucy was 9 years old and had been looking forward to this trip since the beginning of September, when her grandmother had called from Ottawa and said that if they didn't come visit soon, she was going to mail herself to Hamilton in a crate. Lucy had laughed at that and immediately gone to find her father to ask when they could go. She was wearing her yellow rain jacket, which Caleb had stopped trying to convince her was unnecessary indoors 3 winters ago, and she had a new journal on her lap. Cardboard cover, picture of a loon, cream-colored pages that she had designated specifically for train observations. She had already written the date. She had not noticed that her father's hand was still on the armrest. Caleb was the kind of person who had learned, through accumulated experience and one very specific professional humiliation, to be precise about the difference between what he knew and what he suspected. Right now, he knew the pulse was real. He suspected he knew what it meant. He needed someone with access to the undercarriage to confirm the second part, which meant he needed to talk to someone before the train left the station. He raised his hand when the conductor came through. Her name was Brienne Stoker, and she wore the Via Rail uniform with the comfortable authority of someone who had been doing this job long enough for the job to have become part of how she carried herself. She moved through the car with the particular calibrated attention of a person managing 10 things at once, and she had, as people in service roles often do after long practice, developed a quiet taxonomy of passengers that she ran almost without thinking. The man in the canvas jacket in 23A had been slotted somewhere in the lower maintenance category. Traveling with his daughter, packed lunch, nothing from the overhead bins except the backpack they'd already stowed without help. He'd seemed easy. She turned toward him and asked what she could do for him. He told her. He kept it short because he understood that brevity, in these situations, was more likely to be heard than detail. There was a resonant pulse under the seat frame, he said. Interval of roughly 11 seconds. Consistent with structural oscillation rather than mechanical movement. He'd like someone from the mechanical crew to have a look at the bogie before departure. Brienne Stoker listened. She looked at his hand resting on the armrest. She looked at his face, which was calm and uninsistent. She said that trains vibrated, all of them, particularly the older cars on this corridor, and that Via Rail's equipment was serviced on a regular schedule by certified technicians who had cleared this train before departure. Caleb said he understood that, and that what he was describing was different in character from normal operational vibration. He asked again politely whether a mechanical crew member might take a look before they left the station. Brienne Stoker's posture shifted by a degree or two. She said, in a voice that carried clearly to the rows on either side, that she could appreciate that he was concerned, but that she couldn't delay a departure over something that the qualified people had already signed off on. She said it with a tone that was not unkind in intention, but that landed with a specificity hard to mistake. She was closing the question, and she was doing it in a way that situated his concern as the thing being managed. She said he wasn't a rail engineer. She said it gently, with the slight emphasis of someone who considered this a helpful clarification rather than an insult. 2 rows forward, a man named Gareth Tully, who had been on a phone call until 30 seconds earlier, and who had a 2 o'clock meeting in Ottawa with a federal lobbying file he'd been working since spring, looked up from his laptop with an expression that wasn't quite amusement, but that contained all the structural elements of one. 3 students behind them traded a glance. An older man across the aisle looked out the window in the way people look out windows when they are choosing not to be involved. Lucy had looked up from her journal when her father raised his hand. She had been watching everything since then with the careful total attention that 9-year-olds apply to adult situations they don't yet have a full map for. She understood that her father had said something, and that the conductor had said something back, and that the thing her father had said was being treated as not worth responding to seriously. She put her pencil down on the tray table. She looked at her hands. She had been talking about this train trip at school for 2 weeks. She had told her teacher and her friend Darcy and her grandmother on FaceTime, and the crossing guard who had asked how she was doing. She had said each time that she and her dad were taking the real train, and she had said it the way children say things they are genuinely proud of. The pride of it had been sitting in her chest like something warm for 14 days. Right now, it was doing something different. Caleb felt the change in her posture, the way you feel the temperature drop before you've consciously registered the cold. Not dramatically, all at once, but present, and beyond arguing with. He looked at her, he looked back at the conductor. He said that he did not require Brienne Stoker to take his word for it. He only required her to pass the concern to someone in a position to make the call. He said that a resonant frequency of this pattern in a bogie frame component, presenting at idle in cold weather conditions, would change character under thermal contraction once the train was moving at speed, and that a standard pre-departure visual inspection was not designed to detect a subsurface fatigue fracture as along a stress site that's. He said all of this in the tone of a person reading a scheduled maintenance notice. Factual, measured, not looking for a reaction. Brienne Stoker reached for her radio. She called forward to the senior conductor's station and relayed, in the flat professional tone of someone resolving a situation, that she had a passenger in 23A requesting a mechanical inspection before departure. She gave the seat number. She gave the name from the boarding manifest because the voice on the other end had asked for it. The name was Caleb Nourse. Leonard Parrish had been working the Toronto-Ottawa corridor for 22 years. He had the particular stillness that long-service railway people develop. Not passivity, but the calm of someone who had learned to distinguish between urgency and noise, and who acted on urgency without hesitation, precisely because he didn't confuse the two. He was not a man who startled easily, which made it noticeable when he did. He heard the name Caleb Nourse and stopped moving. It was not a famous name. There was no reason for anyone to recognize it unless they had, at some specific point in the past, been in contact with a particular document, a technical memorandum, 43 pages, produced by a structural integrity engineer at a rail component manufacturer called Meridian Rail Systems. The document analyzed fatigue failure patterns in lateral bogie frame arms under repeated thermal cycling, specifically under the cold weather contraction conditions characteristic of Canadian winters. It identified a stress concentration site in a specific model of bogie frame that had been in wide use across the Canadian passenger rail fleet since the mid-90s. It documented the failure initiation sequence, the conditions under which it would present, the inspection protocols that were and were not capable of catching it. The document had been submitted to Transport Canada through a third-party engineering contact and had been received and filed, and not widely circulated. Leonard Parrish had encountered it 7 years ago at a mandatory continuing education symposium in Winnipeg, where a safety educator had used it as a case study between documentation and institutional response. Leonard had read the relevant sections twice. He had thought about them more than once since. The name on the cover had been Caleb Nourse. Leonard set his clipboard down and told his assistant to hold the departure. He walked through 3 cars without stopping. When the door at the forward end of the coach car opened and Leonard came through, the car recalibrated in the way enclosed spaces recalibrate to unexpected authority, not silently, but at a lower register. Gareth Tully had closed his laptop. Leonard walked to row 23. He looked at the man in the canvas jacket, who was sitting with his hand on the armrest, and his daughter beside him, in a yellow rain jacket with an open journal on the tray table, and he asked, without preamble, whether he was the Caleb Nourse who had worked at Meridian Rail Systems. The car went still. Caleb said yes. He said it the way you confirm a fact that has not been relevant in a long time. Without expectation, without performance, with the quiet flatness of someone who has not been waiting for this moment but recognizes it when it arrives. Leonard told him to show him where. Caleb put his hand back on the armrest. He described the pulse, the interval, the variance. He said the frequency was consistent with a resonant response in the bogie frame rather than the wheel assembly, which pointed to structural rather than wear, and that under the thermal contraction conditions of the current temperature, 9 degrees Celsius, with the forecast calling for a further drop by the time they reached the Kingston corridor. A fatigue fracture at the stress concentration site he had documented would produce this exact pattern at idle before it changed character at speed. He said it the way a person states a measurement they have already taken twice and confirmed both times. Leonard picked up his radio and requested a mechanical hold. He asked for the on-call maintenance crew to come to car 4. He turned to Brienne Stoker, who had followed him at a distance and was standing 6 rows back, and told her the departure was being held. Lucy had been watching all of this from approximately 4 inches behind her father's shoulder. She was old enough to understand that something important was happening, and young enough to understand it mostly through the change in the way adults were looking at her father. A few minutes ago they had been amused or nearly amused, or at minimum satisfied that a disruption was being contained, and now they were not. Now the senior conductor of the train was standing in the aisle, treating her father's words like instructions. She didn't know what a bogie frame was. She didn't know what a stress concentration site was. But she understood the gap between the way people looked at her father when he picked her up from school in his work truck with the dented passenger door and the way they were looking at him now. And that gap was wide enough to make something tighten in her chest in a way she didn't yet have language for. Her father put a hand briefly on her knee, the way he always did when he was telling her, without words, that everything was being handled. Then he turned his attention back to the conductor. What Caleb Nourse had been, before he became the man in the canvas jacket in coach, was not a story he told often, not because he was ashamed of it. Because the version that was true was too complicated for the exchange of small talk, and the version that fit into small talk made him sound either bitter or broken, and he was neither, though he had been adjacent to both at various points in the years since Meridian. He had spent 8 years as a structural integrity engineer at Meridian Rail Systems, working in the space between materials science and failure prediction, studying how metal aged under the specific and repetitive stress of railway operation, cold contraction, Thermal expansion, the micro-fatigue of 10,000 identical load cycles. He was good at it in the way that some people are good at things that can't be entirely taught. He had the pattern recognition, the ability to look at data and feel where it was pointing before the numbers had finished resolving. He had written the memorandum after 14 months of analysis. He had identified, through a combination of load data and thermal modeling, that the lateral frame arms in Meridian's Series 7 bogie, a component installed across a significant portion of the Canadian passenger rail fleet, contained a stress concentration site that standard inspection intervals were not designed to reach. He had tried twice through internal channels to have the maintenance protocol upgraded. The first attempt produced a working group. The second produced a revised working group that arrived at a different conclusion. The memorandum went further than the internal process had allowed him to go. He documented the failure sequence in full. He submitted it to Transport Canada through a contact in the safety engineering community. 3 weeks later, Meridian's legal team described the document as unauthorized analysis produced outside the bounds of his authorized role and his continued insistence on the finding as conduct inconsistent with his position. He was offered a settlement. He declined. He was removed in a restructuring 18 months later that produced no paperwork connecting his departure to the memorandum. His wife Ruth had been watching the slow collapse of their financial stability and his deepening absorption in the fight with the kind of exhaustion that has its own internal logic. She was not wrong to be exhausted. The timing of what came next, her diagnosis 2 years after he left Meridian, the 3 years that followed, and then the morning in March when Lucy had come into his room, and the world had permanently reorganized itself around the fact of Ruth's absence, had added a specific and unremovable weight to everything else. He had Lucy. He moved to Hamilton. He found work maintaining industrial equipment because the mechanical intuition that had made him useful at Meridian hadn't gone anywhere. The industry had simply made him unwelcome. He had, with genuine effort and over several years, stopped being angry about it. He had not, because this is not something you choose, stopped seeing what he saw when something wasn't right. Lucy had watched her father read the safety card when they boarded, not skimming it the way most people pretended to, but actually reading it, front to back, without any self-consciousness about the attention this required. She had watched him locate the 2 emergency exits within 2 minutes of sitting down and note them to her without making it sound frightening. She had asked him once why he always looked at things so carefully. He had told her that the things most worth knowing about tend to introduce themselves quietly. She had written that down in her loon-cover journal the night before. Now she sat in the strange suspended atmosphere of a train that wasn't going anywhere and took her journal out and held it without opening it. The mechanical crew arrived at platform level within 12 minutes. The lead technician was a compact woman named Gwen, who had been with Via Rail for 11 years, and who approached mechanical anomalies with the steady skepticism of someone who had investigated a great many false alarms and understood that the only way to tell them apart from real ones was to look carefully. Beside her was a younger technician named Ross, who still had the faint over-alertness of someone building the internal reference library that experience eventually makes automatic. Gwen looked at the bogie with a flashlight and said, in the tone of a person preparing to close a question, that it looked clean. Leonard told her to look at the lateral frame arm, port side, where the passenger in 23A had indicated. Gwen looked for a longer time. She asked Ross to hand her the ultrasound wand. What the wand found was not catastrophic in isolation. It was not the kind of finding that would appear in a standard visual inspection, because standard visual inspection was designed to find a different class of problem. What it found was a density anomaly along the inner radius of the lateral frame arm. A thin, irregular discontinuity consistent with the early stage of a fatigue fracture positioned precisely at the stress concentration site documented in the Meridian Memorandum. Gwen took photographs. She and Ross conferred briefly in voices that were low and level. Then she straightened up and told Leonard that the car should not depart. She said the fracture, if that was what it was, and she believed it was at a stage consistent with a crack that had been developing over multiple service cycles, the kind of thing that would have continued to pass visual inspection because it was below the surface, right up until the moment it didn't. She said she needed to flag it to the safety desk. Cassandra Lee, the Regional Operations Director for Via Rail's Ontario Corridor, arrived at Union Station 40 minutes later. She was accompanied by a safety liaison named Audrey Lim and by the contained urgency of someone who had spent the drive from her office absorbing the operational and regulatory implications of what she was walking into. She was not prepared for the name Leonard gave her when he explained how the anomaly had been identified. Cassandra had been in railway operations for 14 years. Early in her career, she had participated in a risk assessment review that referenced, in its technical bibliography, a Meridian Rail Systems memorandum on bogie frame fatigue patterns. She had read the summary. She had moved on. The name on the document had existed, until this moment, as a citation in a footnote. She stood in the operations office at Union Station and experienced the specific disorientation of a footnote becoming a person who had been sitting in coach with a packed lunch and a child in a yellow rain jacket, and whom her conductor had publicly told he wasn't a rail engineer. The conversation that followed between Cassandra, Audrey, and the Transport Canada inspector named Everett Solis, who arrived within the hour and whose questions had the precise, methodical quality of someone building a regulatory record, was the kind of conversation that happens when a near miss reveals not an accident, but a pattern. Patterns are harder to fix than accidents because they imply the accident was always nearby, waiting for the right conditions to line up. Meridian's Series 7 bogie frame was installed across multiple Via Rail cars in the Ontario Corridor fleet. The maintenance protocol in place since the early 2000s used inspection intervals and methods that Caleb's memorandum had specifically identified as insufficient for detecting fractures at the stress concentration site in question. The memorandum had been submitted to Transport Canada 9 years ago. It had been received and filed. The fleet had continued operating on the existing protocol. Everett Solis asked to speak with the passenger who had identified the anomaly. He found Caleb at a table in a corner of the departures lounge, with Lucy beside him, working through a cup of hot chocolate and 3 chapters of a book she had brought in her backpack. Everett introduced himself and told Caleb what he was there to do. He said he intended to formally cross-reference the Meridian Memorandum against the current inspection protocol deviations, and that if the pattern was systemic, if the fracture in Car 4 was consistent with the failure progression the memorandum had documented, and if similar fractures were present in other cars on the same maintenance cycle, the scope of the review would need to expand significantly. Caleb listened to this and felt something that was not satisfaction and not vindication, though it was in the same neighborhood as both. It was the particular sensation of a thing that has been true for a long time finally being in a room where it was allowed to be true. He told Everett what he thought needed to be said, that the inspection protocol deviation was almost certainly not isolated, that the maintenance culture which had produced it was environmental rather than individual, an organization that had, over time, defaulted to the minimum adequate interpretation of its own protocols because the operational pressure to minimize downtime was continuous and immediate, while the consequences of under-cautious maintenance were statistical and deferred. A review that treated the fracture in Car 4 as an individual finding without examining the culture that had allowed it to go undetected would produce a conclusion without a remedy. Everett took notes. He was the kind of person who took notes in a way that meant he was actually listening, which Caleb recognized as a quality shared by every professional he had ever trusted. Caleb said, half to himself, that rail systems don't fail because of one overlooked signal. They fail when the habit of overlooking small signals becomes the ambient condition. Brianne Stoker had been standing near the edge of the operations office for the better part of an hour, present because her post required it and uncertain what her role in this particular version of events was supposed to be. She heard what Caleb said. She looked at him when he said it. She did not look away. Via Rail's expanded inspection of the Ontario corridor fleet took 11 days and covered 17 cars sharing the maintenance pool with the original train. 4 additional lateral frame arms were flagged for component-level review. The findings were submitted to Transport Canada in a full deviation report, documented and public. Everett Solis's office cross-referenced the Meridian Memorandum against the inspection deviation records and submitted a formal citation of the document to the National Rail Safety Archive. It was a small administrative action. The document moved from the informal submission category it had occupied for 9 years to the status of a reference technical finding. Caleb was eating breakfast on a Tuesday morning when the notification arrived on his phone. Lucy was at the table with him, working through cereal, not paying attention to what he was looking at. He read the notification once. He set the phone face down on the table and poured himself more coffee. The formal consulting proposal from Cassandra Lee arrived 3 weeks later, while Lucy was at school and Caleb was at the industrial plant in Burlington where he'd been working a motor replacement. He read it at his workbench. The proposal offered a consulting engagement focused on bogie frame inspection protocol modernization for the Ontario corridor fleet. Written into the formal engagement terms was a requirement that the Meridian Memorandum be formally reviewed as part of the protocol assessment, not as a legal concession, but as an engineering necessity. He thought about Cassandra's offer the way he had learned to think about things that mattered. Not with the quick reflexive answer, but with the slower and more disciplined attention of someone who had learned that the first answer was not always the truest one. He had been hurt by this industry in layers. Not once, dramatically, but in the accumulated way that organizations hurt people who see things the organization isn't ready to see. Through attrition, through process, through the slow grinding of institutional preference over individual judgment. The offer of a consulting role from a carrier whose conductor had publicly dismissed him 3 weeks earlier was not a simple thing to accept. He thought about Lucy. She had asked him once, in the way children ask things they have been turning over for a while without quite knowing how to raise them, whether the work he did fixing machines was the work he had always wanted to do. He had answered her honestly, which was that it was useful work, and that he was good at it, but that it was not the work he had built himself to do. He set one condition in writing before he signed, that any protocol revision arising from the engagement be shared with the full maintenance community, not filed internally. The problem was systemic. A systemic problem treated as a local one would reconstitute itself somewhere else on the network. Cassandra agreed. He accepted the consulting role on a part-time basis, structured around Lucy's school schedule. He did not accept it to be right. He had known he was right for 9 years, and being right had not kept the Series 7 bogie in Car 4 from developing a fracture. He accepted it because there was a version of this industry less likely to produce what that Tuesday in October had produced: a conductor's taxonomy of passengers, a maintenance protocol's ambiguous language, and 9 years of filed and forgotten documentation all converging in the same morning on a train that was 12 minutes from leaving the station. If the path to that version ran through his particular knowledge and his willingness to walk back into rooms that had once been arranged to exclude him, then that was the work. It had always, if he was honest, been the work. Before boarding the replacement train to Ottawa that same October afternoon, 3.5 hours behind schedule, on a different car, under a sky that had gone the particular flat gray of an Ontario October doing its honest work. Brianne Stoker found Caleb near the gate. She had spent the intervening hours deciding what to say, and had arrived at the conclusion that whatever she said would be insufficient, which meant the only question was whether insufficient was better than silent. She had been in this job for 8 years. She had developed, without quite intending to, a taxonomy of passengers: the entitled ones, the anxious ones, the ones whose difficulty came from fear, and the ones whose difficulty came from ego, and she had placed Caleb into that taxonomy the moment she saw the canvas jacket and the daughter, and the slightly too attentive way he watched the car. She had been wrong. Not about the jacket or the daughter, about what those things meant, which was nothing. Nothing about whether the person behind them had something worth hearing. The error was not the assessment itself, but the decision to let the assessment replace the listening. She said she hadn't known who he was. Caleb looked at her for a moment and said that she hadn't needed to know who he was to hear what he was saying. He said it without heat, without performance, the way a person states a principle they have applied consistently enough, that it no longer requires emotional reinforcement. Brianne was quiet. She had been prepared for a version of this conversation where she apologized, and he accepted it, and the transaction was complete. She was not prepared for the sense that the conversation was about something larger than the transaction, that the lesson embedded in the afternoon was not about Caleb Nourse specifically, but about the habit of sorting people before listening to them, and the particular cost of that habit when the sorting is wrong and the moment is time-sensitive. She turned to Lucy and apologized to her directly, which she had not planned to do, but which felt, once she started, like the part of the apology that mattered most. The part that acknowledged a child had been made to feel her father's diminishment in a public place. Lucy looked at her and said, "It's okay," in the way that 9-year-olds say things that mean something more conditional than the words. Caleb told Brianne that if she wanted to do something useful with what had happened, the most useful thing wasn't apology but adjustment. Specifically, building the habit of passing concerns upward rather than resolving them at the point of contact, because the point of contact was not always where the relevant expertise lived. Brianne said she understood. He said that what happened the next time a passenger said something that made her impatient would be a better measure of understanding than anything she said right now. She absorbed this without flinching, which was something. She said quietly that she would not dismiss something like this again. He said, "The next one may not wait for you to be ready." Leonard Parrish found Caleb near the boarding gate before the line formed. He said that he had been referencing the Meridian Memorandum in safety conversations for years. Not formally, not institutionally, but in the way that people who actually care about a profession carry knowledge that the institution hasn't caught up to yet. He said that reading a document about a person and then watching that same person locate a structural fault from an armrest in coach were two very different kinds of education. Caleb shook his hand. He said the memorandum had never been the point. The point was the fracture. The fracture was the same today as it had been 9 years ago, and the industry was still deciding, in real time, which one it wanted to pay attention to. Leonard nodded once, the nod of a man who understood exactly what was being said and had the professional wisdom to leave it exactly where it was. On the replacement train, Lucy claimed the same window seat. Caleb found this quietly significant. She looked out at the platform with the settled composure of someone who had made a decision, somewhere in the middle of a very long afternoon, not to be afraid of this anymore. The sun had moved while they waited, and the light through the window was different now. The late October quality that southern Ontario produces before dusk, when the air at altitude cools and the sky begins to do its slow work of going from pale to deep. Caleb sat down beside her and ran his hands once along the armrests, the way he always did, not anxiously but attentively, the habitual orientation of a person who notices the physical world they move through. The armrests were still. Brienne Monroe moved through the car doing her pre-departure check. When she reached row 23, she paused and said, with a precision of tone that suggested she had chosen the words carefully, "Mr. Nourse, not sir, not a seat number, his name." Lucy noticed. Caleb noticed. A woman 2 rows forward who had been on the original car and had watched the entire afternoon unfold noticed as well, and filed it in the category of small corrections that carry within them a disproportionate weight of meaning. The train pushed back from the platform and the engines climbed through their startup register, and Lucy reached over and tucked her hand inside her father's arm the way she had as a much smaller child, when the world was still organized, mostly into things that frightened her and things that didn't, and her father had been the primary mechanism for moving between the two. The train lifted into speed and Toronto fell away behind them, and the fields of Ontario opened up in the long flat gold of late afternoon, the sky doing the patient Canadian thing of reminding you how much of it there is. Lucy took out her loon-cover journal after a while. She wrote, "Dad says that the things most worth knowing introduce themselves quietly. Today I watched him prove it." She didn't show it to him. She closed the journal and looked out at the landscape moving past, the cedars along the cut, the farmland going amber in the October light, the occasional flash of a lake catching the last of the afternoon, and the wheels ran clean and true beneath them, and the frame held its pressure without a vent, as it was maintained to do, as it was always supposed to do, on a country's worth of track that stretched from one ocean to the other and depended, in the end, on people willing to say the quiet and unfashionable thing. That a small signal noticed and passed on was worth infinitely more than a large problem ignored until it wasn't small anymore.